Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'll be reviewing the latest season of Big Brother Canada BB-Can 10, which notably ends up being a really dynamic season here, quite possibly the most dynamic house we've ever seen in Big Brother, where again we spend most of the season without a well-defined power structure, which is such a rarity, especially in modern Big Brother, where even in BB-Can 9, despite how crazy the gameplay was there, it did have defined alliances and sides, which on BB-Can 10 here, we really didn't have until like the halfway point, and even then those sides were very loose. So that obviously ends up being a massive pro for this season, where again we had shifting dynamics round after round, and the season ends up being pretty consistently crazy from week to week. And to also boon that, we do also have was probably the most accurate edit in the history of BB-Can, which again is a show that is notoriously known for having inaccurate edits, with like BB-Can 6 being the massive example of this, with that being another of the more dynamic houses in the history of the show. And it felt like production didn't know how to properly edit the story there. While here with BB-Can 10, we see them being more committed to accurately portraying the events of the game. And really for the most part, the season really does continue this upward trajectory BB-Can has had since the last season, with them once again making a pretty strong season here. And to fully go into why, like my other reviews, I'll be running through the season from beginning to end. Let's start off with week 1, which in BB-Can tradition is really rushed, and through that we don't really get a true sense of what's going on here and why things are happening, where the premiere is mostly spent on content we already got in the preseason, while episode 2 contains the entirety of the round of gameplay, where the story of the week is told in a really incoherent way due to the lack of time. Now, we do start the season with a lot of talk about this being the historic 10th season and how they're going to celebrate that. And with this first week, we do get a lot of that. We do get a lot of callbacks here. And with this first week, we do end up getting a lot of callbacks. But overall, I was actually kind of underwhelmed to see these references wane as the season went on. As, again, week 1 here, we get so many callbacks to BB-Can 1, to the point where initially I was thinking we were going to get like each week themed after a former season, which would have been a really cool format for the season, but obviously that doesn't really come to be. Now we obviously do end up meeting the players right away here, and we do see this instant alliance form in the Honey Bunch. The first 4 players that entered the game, in Jacey, Gino, Summer, and Josh, which was humorous that they bothered to like highlight this alliance here in the premiere episode, which is again like an episode that we rarely get any true strategic content through. But like, despite them highlighting them here, again, it really leads to nothing, despite the fact that all these people end up making pretty deep runs into the season. We do also get introduced to Kyle Moore, whose entire casting story is so bizarre that he was this guy that people confused for Kyle Moore to end up being on BB-Can 9. And through that situation, it'll end up leading to him applying for a show and ending up on the cast here. With that situation even being perpetuated by the BB-Can 9 Ethan getting kicked off in the preseason, it is funny to see how much that ejection just changed BB-Can history here, especially with how notable Kyle's run ends up being on this season. We do also get a notable introduction to Kevin, who instantly plays the villain card, talking about taking out all of Canada's favorites. And it's funny that this really made most people think of him as this joke coming into the season. Like, many people thought he was going to be an early boot, and he does get a bit of a rough start here, but he ends up being the best player of the season. We also get a fun intro to Helena, with her instantly coming off as a fish out of water, and right away she like breaks her glass. We see her like panicking in the pantry. She later forgets what she's saying when introducing herself. And these are all nice character moments for her, despite the fact that she is one of the least prominent figures in the edit across the season. We also see Gino instantly being portrayed as this like eye candy, with him literally just saying that he's like 28 during his intro, and everyone seems to swoon over him. And really, this house's obsession over Gino early on was always so bizarre to me, as I just found them so boring and dull, and for some reason almost everyone in the house just loved him, and he was really well insulated in the game until how blew up their games. So yeah, I really just did not get the appeal of Gino there. But after the intros, we do finally get the first callback to BB Can 1, where we do have the phone starting to ring, and Jay is the one to pick it up, and in turn, they are given safety for the week. Again, a modification from what happened in BB Can 1, where they just handed out HOH this way on that season, and thankfully they changed it. Again, I always felt like that was an awkward way to start the season, to just hand the person that picks up the phone HOH and they instantly have to nominate 2 people. But yeah, I did like this callback here. And then we get to the first actual HOH, which did take up a good chunk of the premiere here, with it being this like multi-part comp. But through this, Herman wins the first HOH, and despite the reduced amount of time here, Herman ends up having one of the better HOHs of the season, largely due to the fact that the season contained so many train wrecky HOHs, with most of them playing suboptimally. But again, episode 2 really just felt like a mess here, where I will praise the editing for what it does moving forward, but this episode in particular did feel like your typical BB Can edit, with like Moose getting all the strategic credit for the episode, despite the fact that he had already been called out for being a sketchy player by the time the feeds had started. We also don't get much real explanation over why the nominees end up on the block here. But again, obviously the major factor here is the lack of time, which again really makes you question why they continue this format of the first week of BB Can. But again, like the explanation of the Jess nomination is just kind of weird, where we get this awkward scene of Moose and Jess arguing over like liking food. And then we have this equally awkward conversation later on with Herman, where they end up reciting lion facts for some reason. And really the entire segment of Herman's one-on-ones felt very sporadic, where we just see random scenes of him talking to people with like no context outside of like one-liners from him in the DR. So again, that scene was a bit of a mess, but Jess and Helena do end up being easy targets here as social outcasts, and surprisingly to me, we do get a veto comp, which, considering the short amount of time they had for this week, and them having eliminated the veto comp in the first week in previous seasons, I really thought they were going to do the same here. But instead, we do get a redo of the first ever POV, where we get some ridiculous humping of balloons, but Jess wins the veto, which starts this really long string of nominees winning the veto and the veto being used, which is obviously propelled by the HOH not playing in the veto and house guest choice being a bit more prominent on the wheel. But overall, I do think this season really solidified that this change in who competes in the veto to be one that's for the positive, though I do think the meta will probably just change moving forward to just backdooring all your targets. But I do think this change was definitely something that did prop up this season. But with that, Kevin ends up being used as a pawn, and again, in BB Can tradition, they do turn a very minute thing in Kevin using info from Helena against her to make it seem like that's the reason why Helena is going home, when in reality, Helena was always going home. And she obviously gets evicted here in an 11-2 vote, with Jess and Jay throwing sympathy votes. But before we end the week, we do get a weird twist where the person that survives the vote gets to open a mystery door where they get prizes, and Kevin gets a whopping $500. And this was pointless and just kind of embarrassing. And even the producers seem to think so, as they don't continue to do it moving forward. But again, what a strange way to end this round. But again, we do lose Helena, who, I'll be honest, I think is going to be super forgettable as time goes on. I mean, even in her boot episode here, she barely gets any content, with Jess getting a larger focus, with them being propelled as the initial target when it seems like that wasn't even necessarily the case. And really, it just seemed like Helena just was not meant for Big Brother, with her like openly hating people and not seeming to socialize or strategize. So while she did seem to have some promise in the preseason, I feel like at this point, her going first here is probably for the best for the season. But now let's jump into week 2, where right away we get introduced to the Savage 7, the typical super alliance that forms every season, with Herman getting the credit for the formation of it, and like the Sunsetters last season, this alliance seemed to be poised to dominate the game. Had the players in the game been somewhat stable in their gameplay, but really by the halfway point in this week, this alliance was already not looked at seriously by most of its members. But the formation of this alliance ends up being an introduction to Herman's playstyle, where he is pretty much the only player on this season that tries to play in this Derek mold of setting up a power structure with the strong players and running that alliance to the end, which is a playstyle that has been extremely successful in recent BBUS seasons, but Herman's entire run on this season really revolves around him trying to set up this structure, only for other players to continuously mess it up, due to the majority of them, again, having a radically different playstyle than him. We then get to the HOH, which ends up being the first of numerous Marty HOHs, and his initial target was going to be Steph, but with her being second in the comp and them kind of making a deal, it does lead to her being safe, despite Marty constantly telling her that he would have put her up, which is a very classic trait of Marty, of him leaking information that ends up harming his game and being a bit too honest. But with her safe, Marty now plans on targeting Jay for some reason. I mean, he does say that, okay, he doesn't trust Jay, but we really get no explanation as to why. Now, along the way, we do get the typical weekly sponsorships, with the HOH getting an outfit from winners, and that's just an awkward segment. We also get the players going to Wendy's as normal, and they get message from the previous winners of the show, which was a cool callback. But again, this did feel like the only consistent callback across the season. But also here we do get the establishment of the Gino-Marty relationship that goes all over the place across this season. But at this point, Gino has a final two with Kyle, and they seem to be solidly working as a trio with Marty. But Gino also is involved in this love triangle with Steph and Jace, and his showmance with Jace gets so much screen time in this round that really felt like a waste of time on the show. And I get that it's kind of setting up the fact that Jace does end up being used as a pawn this week, and this like dilemma of Gino's on whether or not to tell her, but it's like still mostly boring content there. But talking about Jace, like I know Jace is someone that gets brought up as being a player that is way too passive and not really playing the game for a lot of it, but I will say that I do think she actually does pretty good work this week, where I did feel like after being nominated, she kind of recognized that she needed to step her game up a bit and did start to have more game talks and start to socialize a bit more. So again, I will give her some credit for that here. And she does also end up eventually winning the veto in what seemed like a comp stacked against her, considering literally all of the other players playing were people who wanted to keep Jay around. And Jay themselves do get some solid content throughout the week through their relationship with Josh, which was a pretty heartwarming one. Though they do also end up in some drama that happened between them and Kyle, which was overall pretty bad look for Jay, with them misrepresenting Kyle's actions. So it was probably better for them that they make it on the show. But as for the renom, it was initially supposed to be Kevin as an easy pawn, but there were rumblings of potentially flipping the vote to save Jay, and through that, Marty changes his mind, which may not be the only time this season. And without telling most of the house, he ends up backdooring Betty, which was a poor play for Marty, as he really just needlessly pisses off half the house here. And also, like in the edit, I did feel like they tried to give Jess a lot of credit for this move. And though they definitely do deserve some credit, I did feel like the show kind of undermined how well Kevin handled Marty through this round to make him eventually put up Betty. And this is also kind of like the start of showing how well Kevin handles Marty moving forward. But this entire Betty backdoor does lead to some fun content, like Kevin's "I'm a bad boy" DR, which is one of the funniest ones from this season. We get Betty getting irrationally upset at Marty for having told her to kick her feet up. But even more ridiculous is like the start of this Kevin-Betty feud, where she's upset at Kevin for saving himself here for some reason. And she tells him he's a terrible person and that she'll never be ready to talk to him. And all this was really, really fun. But really, this round ends up being pretty subdued by the end of it, with Jay obviously going home here and not being able to gain any real traction against Betty. Though I did appreciate how much tact they put into their campaign, with a lot of planning on how to approach each faction, but really the vote ends up being pretty obvious, despite Herman and Kyle both throwing hinky votes. Before moving on, let's talk about Jay, who I did find to be a mostly likable and sympathetic figure through their short run on this season, and one that really isn't that bad of a player for an earlier boot here. Now, I do think they played too passively early on, but once they got targeted by Marty here, I do think they did decent work in almost putting together a flip that, had he been on the block against Kevin, I think they definitely would have had a pretty decent shot at staying there. I mean, they just seem to be really good at building strong social bonds to where had they just talked a bit more game early on, I do think Jay could have had a solid run here. So I do think Jay as a player has a decent amount of potential if they were ever to play again, but didn't really get to demonstrate that potential here due to some unlucky breaks and also too much passiveness early on. Now let's talk about week 3, which, wow, and what an insane week here. It really all starts with Kyle winning HOH, which, to give context here, coming into this week, Gino and Kyle are essentially in the center of everything, with Kyle being the more active player of the two, being the one to make alliances and the plans for that duo in order to get them into that position, while Gino was probably the person that was better at building individual bonds with people. And with Kyle having won HOH here, this should have been a very easy week for him, with him having a very easy target in Betty, someone who is directly targeting him, but also someone that no one would fault him for targeting, as no one has that great of a relationship with Betty to where they would really fight to keep her. And even beyond that, he also has Jess, this social pariah in the house. That would also be an easy week for him if he were to take them out. And really, both of these targets would have been very easy rounds for him in order to solidify his power structure, similar to that of how Derek played week 3 of BB16. And it really felt like coming into this HOH, Kyle was going to be able to steamroll the game moving forward, which makes it even more insane that he ends up doing the complete opposite. He ends up nominating that are exclusively in his alliances, and through this and his really manic behavior, he ends up turning an easy week where he should have solidified his control into a week where he comes out of it with almost everyone in the house targeting him, and with his own allies distrusting him, and his reputation in the game squandered. So for me, I do feel like this goes down as the worst HOH in the history of Big Brother, as I don't feel like there's ever another point where someone was in such a dominant position coming into their HOH and had such an easy week ahead of them, and turns that into them being the probable next target with a ruined reputation. Again, there's never been this massive of a downfall over the course of one's own HOH to me in the history of Big Brother. So again, Kyle's HOH here ends up being really historic, but again, let's run through it all. We do start off with Kyle admitting that he was one of the hinky votes, which, why? Again, really makes him come off as sketchy here. We do also get the establishment of the Retreat Alliance, which only seemed to be mentioned on the show as Kyle ends up blowing it up by the time nominations, but really it was always kind of a fake alliance. But it was one that Jacey and Steph had actually believed in. Now, a lot of Kyle's sporadic gameplay here does stem from him really just overplaying his hand, where he actively didn't want to make the easy move. I mean, he thought taking out Betty was a waste of an HOH, and that Jess was someone that he had in his pocket, which I will say, credit to Jess for doing pretty decent work with him this week and convincing him of that, which does cause him to look outwards to where he starts to target Steph, as she's the next lowest on the totem pole, and this alone is already a bad move. I mean, Steph is someone that is in his Retreat Alliance, but also someone that literally has nothing else in the game. I mean, the reason she's on the bottom of the pecking order here is because she hasn't made relationships with anyone outside of the Retreat Alliance. So for him to target someone so clearly in his corner over most other people in the house, and someone that has no other options in the game, is already a really bad move. And we do get this really great scene of him telling Steph that she's going on the block, and we have her freaking out, and through this he decides to pin this decision on Moose, who had told him earlier in the day that he would like Steph to go on the block, which pretty much everyone told him that. And everyone wanted Steph gone. Even Jacey, her closest ally, who wanted her gone due to the tension over Gino. But again, him pinning it on Moose here leads to Moose getting called to the HOH, where Moose gives an award-winning performance that causes something to click in Kyle's mind that he really should be targeting Moose, who I haven't even mentioned the fact that they have an out-of-the-game relationship here where they went to college together, which does lead to some humor due to Kyle's overdramatic revealing of his sport media degree to the other players, which is always really funny to me. But again, to target Moose here, someone that is solely loyal to him, and someone that could have been his secret weapon here, them having this secret out-of-the-game relationship, is such a terrible move, especially when it also blows up the Savage 7 that they were both part of, which really causes this disabling of the entire house that really lasts for the majority of the season. Kyle really just single-handedly blows up the entire power structure of the house through this one round of gameplay. Now, I will say that Moose did play his first few rounds really poorly here, to where no one did end up trusting him, largely because he was just throwing out people's names left and right. I mean, he did tell Kyle earlier that he was targeting Herman and T, again, 2 people within their Savage 7 anyway. So again, like, Moose does play the early game here pretty terribly, to where that was obviously like a factor in why Kyle does decide to flip it on Moose, but still, terrible move for Kyle here. And I do love how this segment is followed by Kyle getting a message from John Party that literally tells him to do the complete opposite of what he had just done. But instantly we do see some fun DRs from people like Herman and Summer, who are pissed that Kyle is blowing up their alliances. Though in reality, for Summer in particular, I feel like this was definitely a net positive, considering she was always at the bottom of Kyle's power structure and ends up being one of the best position players after this round. Though again, I do very much question how much of that was her actual ability in the game, as I do feel like most of her being this like anti-Kyle presence was simply due to that truly being how she felt, and not because she was doing it for game reasons. And with her acting so blatantly to Kyle himself that she is against him, I do think this type of play would typically backfire on her, but she is just really fortunate that Kyle sabotaged this game so much to where it wouldn't. But again, the noms end up being Moose and Steph, but not before we get a pretty pointless twist in which Canada gets to give someone safety and they give it to Marty, which didn't affect anything. Initially, at least, considering Marty was always going to be safe. And I mean, this type of twist, especially this early in the game, is one that is overall pretty inoffensive to me. I'm kind of just fine with Canada being able to give someone safety. But again, it will happen again later in the game, and I think at that point it's a bit more egregious. But with the Moose, Steph, noms, it really is insane that Kyle just ends up nominating 2 people from his 2 separate alliances here, which in turn ends up destroying both of them. And also, like, just the entire nomination of Steph here seems very short-sighted, where he decides to nominate her because she's better in competitions than Betty, and in turn is hoping that he'll stop Moose from winning the veto. And he also like plans on also just taking her off after the veto if he had the opportunity, and all this was just too risky. And while a lot of that comes from him not really caring about Steph in the game, it's still a really disastrous move moving forward, where Steph is just such an easy person to flip the votes on when no one cares about Steph in the game. And obviously that's what happens when Moose wins the veto, forcing Kyle to pick a replacement, and initially he thinks he should settle by taking out Betty. But then we add Marty to the story, where Marty ends up getting added to the Savage 7 in place of Moose, but through doing so it makes Marty feel like he is on the bottom, which wasn't an accurate read, as Kyle and Gino were truly loyal to him, and Marty is the one that gets into Kyle's ear about backdooring Josh, which he ends up going through with, which again should have shown to Marty that Kyle is actually loyal to him, especially considering it further burns Kyle's alliance with the Savage 7, and really just saps all of his social capital he had remaining with people like a Herman. And he also does so without truly even securing the votes here, where he knew that the vote would be close, and even ends up blindsiding half the house with the nomination, which further disincentivizes them to vote on his side. So, I mean, really, Kyle just plays this all wrong, and by the end of the week, Kevin ends up flipping as well, during which we get a fun scene between him and Betty, with him trying to convince her to play up their feud, only for her to say, "I do hate you," which again, very funny scene. And really a bad misread from Kevin on how Betty would handle that type of situation. But afterwards, Kevin ends up doing really effective work in flipping over Marty, in a position where, again, this is a terrible move for Marty to flip, where it puts such a big spotlight onto him as the person that Kyle and Gino felt the most betrayed by. But I did like how Kevin incorporated Canada's save into his plea to Marty, making him paranoid that he was in danger, because why else would Canada save him? And this was, to me, the first time I was like truly impressed with Kevin's approach to the game, which obviously ends up being further solidified moving forward. But coming into the eviction here, I mean, Steph ends up being really confident that she's staying for seemingly no reason, where, again, pretty much the entire house is against her at this point. And even though, like, Jace and Gino do eventually vote for her to stay, both of them were also willing to vote her out had they just known the plan beforehand. But we do end up getting a legitimate blindside here that did have some great reactions from Steph, Jace, and Kyle, all while Gino's as boring as ever with no real reaction. But it ends up being a fantastic week of Big Brother. But to be honest, debatable if this is even the best week of the season, with some really strong ones moving forward as well. And again, this is the point where I did start to love the editing of the show, where they did mostly portray this week very accurately. And we do get more genuine DRs across this week, particularly from Kyle. That was a nice change of pace from the typically over-rehearsed DRs. But with that, let's talk about the boot in Steph, who will mostly be remembered for her blindside here, as outside of that, and her calling up Moose to the HOH room, I don't feel like there's much of note from her run on the show. She didn't really end up playing that hard and had no one really loyal to her in the game, despite the fact that she thought she had a number one ally in Jace and had this retreat alliance, what she perceived to be the main alliance in the house, but in reality, she really had nothing. I mean, to me, she ends up being a pretty forgettable character and really a mediocre player. And with that, let's jump into week 4, which starts off with a pretty insane HOH result where Gino wins HOH. Again, one of the people just blindsided the previous round and also Kyle's number one ally. So it really felt like this was the perfect result to cause more chaos in the house, as people that just flipped will now have to go scrambling back to Gino and Kyle. And Kyle, the big target of the week, was someone that you would assume would be safe. But we eventually end up seeing a lot of the aftermath of the Steph blindside, which did give us some fun moments from Gino and Jace, both thinking that the other flipped, despite the fact that they were the only two not in the know of the vote. And we really get this ridiculous scene of Jacey yelling at Kyle, not believing that he was on the blind side, which was a really bad look for her. And we do see Marty initially come off pretty clean from this vote, with Kyle, Gino, and Jacey all thinking that Marty voted with them, only for him to end up admitting to it once Gino wins HOH, and for him to keep on talking about how he deserves to go in the block for betraying Gino. It really just ends up putting a massive bullseye onto him that makes him an easy person for Gino to put up, and also an easy person to get blamed for this entire flip, when in reality he was the last person to join on it, at a point where Steph was already going home anyway. Now, coming into this week, I was expecting Herman to be a big target as well, considering Kyle and Gino both also thought that Herman was fully on their side. And also, I feel like Herman did some pretty poor play in his management of his relationship with Kyle, where he really just starts blasting him, saying that you insulted me as a man. And also had some poor play the previous round, where he really tried to micromanage the votes, which through that caused some distrust between him and people like a Summer, T, and Betty. But I do think overall he does really effective work early on this week in rebuilding his relationship with Gino, to where despite Kyle constantly campaigning to backdoor Herman, Gino ends up refusing to do so. We do also get some campaigning for Gino to put Kyle on the block, which he initially turns down and is initially insulted that Summer in particular would try to get him to nominate his closest ally, which again, the show tries to show this as Summer's campaigning being the reason for Gino's eventual move, but in reality, it was actually an initial negative for her game, while Gino grew respect for someone like a Kevin, who went for the opposite approach to his style of campaigning. And when Gino eventually does change his mind, it has very little to do with what Summer actually did. So I do feel like Summer's overall edit across this week was a bit overblown. But Gino does initially end up nominating Marty and Jess, with him nominating Marty as a message to the other players to not mess with him, or they would be going on the block, which we saw as like an effective strategy on Survivor, like Boston Rob and Redemption Island. But here for Gino, it really doesn't end up being that effective of a strategy. And also, I feel like overall his speech was like really tame, considering the fact that Marty ends up being really insulted by it and really takes it really hard, and largely because like he just cares so much about what Canada thinks of him, which to me is really ironic considering his constant pouting over how hurt he is by the speech. And to me, that was a worse look for him than the actual speech itself. But he does end up winning the veto, being the first person to win 2 comps this season, and I think a large reason for the variety in comp winners this season is due to the neutrality of the comps here. It didn't greatly favor the more physical people as you would typically see on Big Brother, which is a trend I would like to see continue moving forward, as it really did spice up the results of the season. But with the veto being used, Gino now needs a replacement. And initially it did seem like he was going to put up either Betty or T, who most of the house assumed to be this like big player, but in reality was barely playing the game, and seemed to get this reputation largely due to how blatantly social she was. But because she didn't end up talking game with many people, the people she didn't talk game to assumed that that must mean she's talking game to everyone else. And through that, her reputation as a big player really grew despite it not really being warranted. And really, this is a reputation that ends up carrying through with her until her eventual boot. But again, along the way, there are people that do constantly bring up the fact that he is being associated with Kyle. And really, the final straw seemed to be a conversation that he had with Helena, to where Gino decides that it's his best move to backdoor Kyle in order to disassociate himself with Kyle, which I will say is a terrible move from my point of view, and a move that I know some people supported, but I really cannot get behind taking out your closest ally on your own HOH this early in the game when the rest of the house voted the opposite way coming into this week. I mean, to me, like, this is never the right move to get rid of your own ally when you have so much game left. And again, this is a person who will never take you out of the game, wants to go to the end with you, and is also a massive target in front of you. Now, I get the argument that by taking out Kyle, that means Gino won't go in the block against Kyle, which obviously lessens the threat of, like, okay, if Kyle wins veto, then Gino would be the secondary target. But the thing is that they're going to target Gino anyway at this point. I mean, this really doesn't give him any leverage in the game, as by the time he eventually backdoors Kyle, they're already talking about taking out Gino next week. There's already talk from Betty and a T about taking out Gino. And instead of like Kyle and Gino, now it becomes Jace and Gino or Marty and Gino. Like, it really just swaps out the person you're going to be put on the block with. You're still the target next week anyway. And you're just getting rid of a person that would keep you safe had they won power. So again, I really feel like this was a terrible move for Gino. And while it does technically work out for him here, it does put him in a lot of danger moving forward, to where there are numerous people targeting him week after week after week, but he just gets kind of lucked out by certain comp results or the format of like the safety chain and stuff like that. Like, again, he was in a lot of danger moving forward. So I just cannot support this as a good move. And by the time Kyle ends up on the block, there really isn't much he can really do, where the house is so broken apart. I mean, largely to Kyle blowing it up himself. But with there being no real sides to campaign to, it really means that he needs to individually convince 6 individual people that keeping him around is in their individual best interest. And that's a very, very difficult road to maneuver. And I did feel like the eviction episode was mostly pointless, with them spending so much time on the campaign that really didn't matter. Along the way, we do get this really awkward segment where the players are given tasks through the phone, and we have like Kevin dumping spaghetti on himself, and that was dumb. And through this, a lot of people in the house thought a power was given out, and that leads to Betty being the recipient of that speculation that makes her more of a target moving forward, specifically from like a Marty, where really, I mean, Betty was such a non-threat at this point in the game, but for some reason this elevates her threat level. But again, like, most of the round here ends up going out in a bit of a whimper, with Kyle just getting taken out. And Kyle obviously has a really insane run on this season. I mean, he spends the first 2 weeks in a dominant position, seeming poised to run the game, but with him winning HOH, it leads to him actively sabotaging his own game, to where his closest ally ends up backdooring him against his own best interest the very next week. I mean, it really is an insane turn of events that probably worked out as well as it could have for the season. I mean, it would have been boring to just have a Herman or Summer win HOH and it being an easy Kyle boot, or for him to survive this round only for him to be the boring boot for the very next round. Like, to me, it's like, at least he went out with a splash here. That still made this an interesting week, and obviously that's how he's going to be remembered, is for this very monumental downfall here. But I will say that despite that, I don't think he's the worst player in the world. Again, he was able to put himself in a dominant position early on, and I do think if he were to play again, he would probably learn his lessons from the first time around. And if he were able to do so, I think he actually would be a pretty solid player. But obviously, on this season, it was an overall really bad display of gameplay. And now for week 5, which starts off with what could have been a pretty mundane trivia HOH, but to make it somewhat more notable, we do get the return of some BB Can legends, so they say, which was cool to see these players back for these brief instances here, and did lead to some fun DRs from Summer, and it was funny to see like Josh freaking out over seeing Cindy with an S. But Jess ends up winning this HOH, which was another great HOH result for the season, with Jess clearly being on the bottom, and just like the majority of the HOHs this season, they end up playing this HOH pretty poorly and end up worsening their position by the end of the week, with them making moves that benefit other people in the game more so than themselves. And also, despite having the opportunity to formally set up a power structure, they actively refuse to do so and still exit this week as a really expendable player. And a lot of that comes from the fact that Kevin really ends up running their HOH. And this is where Kevin really starts to take control of the game and also starts this war between himself and Herman that Kevin was able to handle really well within the game here, to where Herman didn't even know where these hits to his game were coming from. And I did find this battle between the two to be really fascinating, as it was essentially this conflict between two radically different approaches to the game. Again, Herman being this Derek-esque power structure based player, while Kevin approaches the game in a more similar way to a Daniel Reyes or Dan Giesling of playing the middle and reveling in the chaos. So I did find it fun to see these two philosophies clash here, especially when Kevin ends up winning out in most of their battles here, which is very contrary to the way that modern Big Brother has typically played out. But we do end up seeing Jess initially want to put up Herman and Gino as the two people that have nominated them, but Kevin does really good work across this week to pull in Jason, Gino, and in turn keeping them off the block, and in turn starting a working relationship with them. And I'll also say that I do think Jace actually does some decent work this week in building a relationship with Jess to the point where it does keep her and Gino safe as well. And really with this week, we do start to see the semblance of a power structure starting to form, with Kevin doing really active work in trying to set up these two sides with the hopes that they eventually go after each other and he's able to take out the threats from both of the sides. And seeing this plan come to fruition was really fun to see. But with this, Moose ends up being the other nominee due to being the strongest person on the opposing side, and this is where we do get a bit of ickiness from an argument between Jess and Moose over what he said about Betty being undeserving. And along the way, Jess shows some microaggressions through calling Moose explosive when he was really anything but. And again, really not a good look for Jess here, with them coming off as really indignant, especially like moving forward, where we get like to the nomination ceremony where Herman and Moose are like joking around and Jess calls it disrespectful, which is again ridiculous, but Herman ends up winning the veto. And this is where the week gets really interesting, as this is where I feel like Kevin does even more impressive work here, convincing Jess to backdoor Tanisha, who, while T was definitely not someone super loyal to Jess anyway, he was at least someone that Jess had a working relationship with. So for Jess to take out T here, especially over Moose at this point, is a particularly bad move for them, but Kevin in effect is able to get them to do so. Again, partially due to this misguided perception of T being this massive strategic player, which again causes Jess to come out of this week with two really solid competitors in Herman and Moose directly coming for them, while getting rid of a person who is less likely to win competitions, and also someone that is more willing to work with them moving forward. But again, the way that Kevin is able to organize this vote is really, really impressive, where he essentially does what Herman wanted to do and failed at during the Kyle HOH, of him micromanaging where all the votes are going, but doing so in a way that doesn't lose him any trust from his allies along the way, where he purposely sets up the vote in a way to solidify these two sides, to make sure that Tanisha goes home, but in a way that has Herman, Summer, Betty, and Josh all still voting that way, and having them still be in conflict with the Jess, Gino, Jason, Marty side of things, while Kevin and Helena can ride the middle. Which, by the way, I should also mention that this is the week on the show that we finally do see the Kevin and Helena final two, called The Ghosts, which very much felt similar to the like Danielle and Jason alliance, and the fact that they were so secretive at this point. But also through this week, we do see the formation of the Crash Test Dummies, where Kevin is able to pull in Josh into that alliance. And I really do love this scene of Kevin telling Josh to come over to the dark side, and really the fact that Kevin is able to get Josh to essentially drop all of his already made final twos, these deals he has with Marty and Betty and Jess and Herman, and get him to go all in on a final two with Kevin is kind of insane, and really ends up being an important piece on the board for Kevin moving forward, with him getting Josh to be this double agent for him, with him telling Josh to still vote with the other side to keep up appearances. So again, a lot of great work from Kevin in this round, and the vote does go exactly as he planned, with a 5-4 vote on T, which I will say it was kind of underwhelming that it didn't end up being a blindside, as it was kind of ruined earlier in the day, but T does still end up calling out Jess on her way out, and at least that rectified it a bit. But with that, let's talk about Tanisha, who did underwhelm me as a player, with her being really passive throughout the game and never really reaching outside of her initial group. But I do think she is another player that has some skill in the game. I think she's clearly skilled at building social relationships, but I just wish she was more active and more strategic in her approach to the game. Though, to be fair, I feel like that is a lesson that could easily be learned. And I feel like if she were to return for a future season, she could potentially become a really solid player, but for her actual run on this season, it ends up being mostly unnotable. But after the T eviction, we do get straight into a double eviction, but not a normal double eviction. We get a chain of safety double eviction, which for the most part, I did like how this was handled. I like the inclusion of the safety chain, this game that we've seen on Sequester, and then BBUS recently used it for the Mon 1 twist, but seeing it modified here to lead up to an eviction vote and also incorporating safety comms, I really did like the overall format here. And while I do feel like this is a format that is easily gamed moving forward, I feel like in this season where like they didn't know it was coming, I do think it really worked out. And we do start off with an individual safety comp, which decides who starts the chain, which Moose ends up winning. And we then have a safety chain playing out until 3 people are left, which mostly goes as expected, where Moose ends up effectively saving his entire group, with Summer handing off the safety to Kevin, which leads to him making another pretty savvy move here in order to hide his alliance with Helena, and him picking Marty. Knowing about Marty and Helena's final 2, and in turn knowing that Marty is going to pick Helena, which ends up working out there, though through that, Jace and Gino end up being in the bottom 3, which does harm his relationship with them a bit here. And it was very surprising to see the showmans at the bottom of the safety chain here, as again, safety chain is a format that should greatly benefit them, as if either of them are ever picked, the other one should almost automatically be safe. So the fact that they were both neglected by their alliance definitely should have been a wake-up call there, and they do end up having to face off against Jess in the next safety comp, where the 2 losers become the 2 nominees, which I really like this game mechanic as well, as it does give the players a better chance at saving themselves, with it now being a 1 in 3 chance instead of a 1 in 5, especially for someone like Jess, who was the social pariah coming into this round. And Jess ends up being so close to winning this comp, blowing away both Jace and Gino, but ends up getting 1 ball in the wrong spot, leading to Jace winning the comp instead. And in the episode itself, it seemed like, okay, this is going to be a pretty boring Jess boot, with them being the targets for most of the people left in the game. But out of nowhere, we do see Marty and Helena vote for Gino. And we later find out that the vote almost flipped here, where Josh and Betty get Kevin, Marty, and Helena together for a brief second to try to flip the vote onto Gino, and it was so close to coming to fruition. And this would have been a great move for people like a Kevin or a Josh, who definitely had Jess as a number here. But the plan does get ruined from Marty being in committal at first, and then Betty kind of flaking out because of that. But another major element of this was that Helena and Marty were on the other side of the couch from Kevin, Josh, and Betty, and had they actually been sitting together, they would have been able to solidify the plan even more, and the plan probably would have gotten through here. So again, these are like many lucky circumstances for Gino here, who again like gets saved by the fact that they don't have enough time to organize the vote, gets saved from the fact that they aren't sitting next to each other on the couch, also gets saved by the fact that Jess gets 1 ball wrong in that safety comp, as it wasn't for that, he would have been on the block against Jason, would have gone home for sure anyway. So really, I mean, Gino 100% should have gone home this round and just gets so lucky. And something I did love about this double eviction here is how we do end up spending a lot of the Monday episode recapping the events of this double eviction, with it ending up being very, very important for the events of the next week, specifically this attempted flip, which leads to another thing I want to mention about the season as a whole here is that I do really feel like the show, for one of the first times possibly ever in BB Can, has truly enhanced the experience with the season. I think something really Big Brother in general has an issue with is that the televised show really feels superfluous. Where if you're someone that does follow the feeds, there really isn't that much reason to actually watch the TV show outside of seeing DRs, and even then it's like very minor information. However, I feel like something this season does pretty well, and like this being an example, the showing of this, the extended showing of what happened during the double eviction, like certain other flashbacks that happened across the season, it really does enhance the overall experience of the season. Mind you, part of that is because the feeds are down for a lot longer on BB Can, which leads to you missing out on more on the feeds and you having to have the show. But I still feel like the show of the season definitely booned my overall opinion of the season. But I really feel like because of sequences like this, it really made the show itself essential viewing for your experience with the season. Before moving on, let's talk about Jess, who is another player that ended up underwhelming me on this season. But unlike figures like J or T, I don't think the amount of potential is there, largely because who Jess seems to be as a person, where Jess just comes off as super intense and just doesn't come off as the greatest social player. And with players like J and T, their issue comes from the more strategic elements of the game, which are much easier to learn, while Jess has to be really a completely different person in my eyes to really have that much potential in any given game of Big Brother. Even though I will say that I do think they did some good work here and there in acting like they were in the pockets of some of the bigger players across the season, but even by the end of their run, they kind of get caught for doing that with multiple people. And really just strategically, I don't think they were all there either. So really, I don't look at Jess too highly as a player here. But with that, let's jump into week 6, which was a bit of a weird week from an episode perspective, with, again, most of the Monday episode encompassing of flashbacks, leading to both the Monday and Wednesday episodes ending abnormally with a to be continued, which was an interesting change to the formula. However, I do feel like the Monday episode definitely utilized this change a lot better than the Wednesday one, where I feel like the Wednesday one largely stemmed from them kind of wasting some time with some unimportant segments. But really, this entire week starts off with Marty being really pissed over what happened at the double eviction, with him having actually voted for Gino, betraying him once again, and thinking he was tricked into turning on Gino. And now he wants revenge on Josh and Betty for setting him up. And this is all just really ridiculous, especially considering how much vitriol he has towards Josh and Betty moving forward. And I really feel like this all just comes from his own guilt over voting for Gino and him not being willing to take the blame or responsibility for his actions. And what do you know? We get to the HOH where Marty wins his second HOH, and we get another really bad HOH from him, but this one probably even worse. With this one in particular ending up leading to him being a bit of a social pariah in the house moving forward. But we do start off with another situation where Marty could have easily gotten away with lying about his vote, where Gino fully believes it's Josh and Betty that voted for him and thinks it couldn't have been Marty because he wouldn't betray me again. But again, Marty is the one to eventually reveal this information himself after he had already won the HOH, which makes it look even worse for him, considering it makes it look like he was only going to release this information once he was safe. But he once again does this constant pouting and talking about him betraying Gino and needing to make it up to him, which really reinforces in Gino's eyes that he needs to target him moving forward. And really, again, Marty comes out of this HOH with pretty much everyone but Kevin and Helena being willing to target him in the next round, with him and Gino being the two most likely boots coming into the next round, had people within their core not had one HOH. But to make this all up to Gino, Marty ends up telling Gino that he will nominate whoever he wants, to which Gino tells him to nominate Moose and Josh, and who would have guessed it, Marty doesn't end up going through with that. Despite Marty even going as far as telling Moose that he's going on the block, after he had already told him that he was safe beforehand, and then later changes his mind again. So again, this was all just a mess. And again, all because Marty wants revenge. So the noms do eventually change to Josh and Betty, though to be fair, the thought of Betty having a power and potentially winning the veto and saving Josh with it also played into that choice as well. But the noms don't even end up happening on the episodes until the Wednesday episode, with the Monday episode ending with this conversation between Kevin and Marty, with Marty being so pissed at Josh and Betty that he ends up slamming the table, which again was such a bad look for him. And again, this is someone that is so obsessed with what Canada thinks of him. But to me, his actions over the course of this week really just make him look worse and worse. And along the way, we do also get this weird fight between Summer and Marty over whether or not she pitched the Marty backdoor to Jess, and this scene of them bickering back and forth, of him saying Jess wasn't lying, her saying Jess was lying, back and forth over and over again. It's just so ridiculous. It really feels like a fight you would see between two children there. But along the way, we do get some more impressive work from Kevin. First, in the fact that this Gino plan didn't backfire on him, where really he is the main one that was trying to get everyone to agree to the plan, and for some reason no one seems to remember that. and he ends up coming out of this pretty much scot-free. Also, Kevin ends up winning the veto this round, which, to be fair, was largely due to the fact that Gino didn't know how to spell nominees, but he does end up doing really effective work with this veto, where despite Marty's constant talk about how he would never nominate Herman because he made a 1-week truce with Herman, Kevin and Helena are able to flip Marty on Herman, with, again, Kevin just seeming to know how to manipulate Marty here, where it is a very delicate situation, as you need to convince Marty that it is his idea, as Marty is someone that actively rejects an idea whenever he feels like he's being manipulated. And I really feel like this type of manipulation is something that Kevin really masters across the season. And we do see Marty eventually backdooring Herman, which was a pretty great moment here. Again, a moment where very clearly Herman was completely blindsided. And really, this should have been checkmate for Herman here, with Kevin finally getting his way and taking out Herman. But Herman does a really great job at campaigning here as well. I mean, at one point, Herman had all the votes that he needed to stay. He had Moose. He had the showmance flipped over, which, I mean, to be fair, it probably wasn't the best interest for showmance to keep Herman anyway, as Herman and Gino had this like agreement to not target each other, and also Herman's just such a massive shield for them. But also, Herman's even able to flip over Summer, to the point where Summer tells Betty that she's unsure of where her vote is going, which was another really poor display of gameplay from Summer's end here, particularly in the fact that she's just too honest. And through that ends up burning trust, really putting Betty in Josh's corner moving forward. But again, Herman had the votes at one point, but Kevin and Josh and even Betty actually do really effective work in flipping Summer back in later showmance. So again, this was a really fun battle to see between Herman and Kevin across the season. That obviously does end with Kevin winning out here. And Herman ends up becoming the first member of the jury, and what was a bit of a surprise for the jury to start at 10, and even he seemed surprised and disappointed that he couldn't just go home, which was humorous. But again, let's talk about Herman, who, despite his placement here, is one of the best players on this season. I mean, while he does have his faults, he was one of the more active players across the season, and that activeness did actively save him at multiple points across the season. Through him building relationships and alliances with Gino and Josh, that ended up keeping him safe at points. And again, he is the type of player that is currently dominating the meta of BBUS, with him being a competent all-around player and one that focuses around setting up power structures. And had this been BBUS, I feel like he would have been a clear frontrunner to win the season. But because this house was so dynamic, he really wasn't able to keep anything together here. But again, I do still look at him as a pretty strong player, and one that I would definitely like to see get another shot at some point down the road. But now that, let's move on to week 7, which for the most part ends up becoming one of the more tame weeks of BB Can 10 here, but still one with a bevy of notable moments within it. We do start off with the return of Buzzkilled, one of my favorite BB Can comps, to the point where I even bothered to try to watch the feeds live myself, which made even more annoying the fact that the comp was canceled due to them not being able to get the buttons working properly, which I don't get why Big Brother has issues with this. I mean, BBUS had similar issues in the past. It's like, is it that hard to find functioning buttons? But instead we get before or after, which was just underwhelming. Though through it we do get some temptations. Obviously a leftover from Buzzkilled, and Summer decides to go for a slot pass, thinking she has no chance in the comp, ironically leading to her missing out on a tie with Gino by 1 point, but again, Gino ends up winning HOH instead, which really ends up saving him considering how he was such a major backdoor target coming into this week. And right away, we see Gino come up with a plan to backdoor Marty, where he decides to get the entire house on board this plan outside of Kevin and Helena, which ends up being a really terrible decision for him to not inform them on the plan, as clearly this is going to get back to them at some point. And again, this is a point also where Gino and Jace are planning on taking Kevin and Helena to 4. Which makes this entire decision even more ridiculous in the fact that they're severing trust between the people that they want to go to the end with. And yeah, I get that Kevin and Helena are the only ones that would want to save Marty, and they don't want Marty to know about the back door, but again, like, you're telling the entire house. They're gonna find out at some point. It just very much felt like a short-sighted move here. But we do see the back door go into action, where Summer and Moose are used as pawns, and again, almost everyone agrees to end up using the veto here, and we do get a fantastic veto pick for the majority, where Helena is the only one picked that wouldn't use the veto, and what do you know, Helena wins the veto. And really, no one actually even bothers trying to convince her to use the veto. And instead, Kevin and Helena are able to do effective work across the week in convincing everyone that the Marty backdoor was a dumb plan to begin with. Convincing Josh it was the wrong plan, and later convincing the showmans that it wasn't the right plan either, as exemplified by the secret veto, which ends up coming out of nowhere here, where Jacey ends up finding a note inside a new pot of flowers, which leads to half of the Wednesday episode being dedicated to Jacey finding this secret veto, only for her not to use it, which was, one, such a waste of time on the episode, but also was such a blown opportunity for Jace here. Not in the way that I think most people are talking about it, where like most people were talking about it as if it was really detrimental to her game for not using the veto, which I don't think it was that bad of a move to not use it, but it is one where I do think it could have been a massive move to add to her resume had she ended up using it, largely due to the sentiment of them having been already convinced that the Marty move wasn't the right move for them, which ironically I don't think it was the right move for Gino, the person that actually wanted to make the move a reality. But I do think it was probably the right move for Jace, the person who actively doesn't end up using it, as Marty is a big threat in the game at this point, and is also someone that she doesn't have as close a relationship to as Gino does. So I do think it would have been in her best interest to get rid of Marty here. But really, again, like the secret veto just ends up being a pretty big flop here, largely due to the fact that it was also only available for one round, which through that and the fact that she couldn't tell anyone about the power really just sapped all the potential out of this twist. But really beyond this, it was pretty clear that Moose was going home, with him never really gaining much traction, and really the Thursday episode really wastes a lot of time on the campaign again that really didn't matter. Though it was funny to see how it highlighted Summer's terrible campaigning across the episode, but again, Moose does end up getting voted out here unanimously, and Moose was a fun presence on this season. I mean, he really came in here playing hard, despite the fact that he knew nothing about Big Brother, and really I think that is the greatest flaw of his on this season, is his lack of game knowledge, where like T or J, I do feel like Moose has so much potential had he had a better sense of the strategic game, where he already is a solid competitor, a good social player, and is also a fantastic character, to where had he just had the strategic game, I do think he would have been a perfect house guest for this season. But still, I think he was a likable figure on this season, one that I wouldn't be that surprised if we do see him play again at some point down the road. Now for week 8, which starts off pretty slow actually, with it feeling like a possible decline in the season, but it ends up being one of the most insane weeks in the history of the show. Now we do start off with an endurance comp, which ends up going for a ridiculous amount of time. I mean, it goes for over 5 hours, to the point where they decide to change the rules, which is something that I really hated here, as they stopped allowing the players to use the sides as leverage, which ends up turning the comp into an extremely upper body based competition, which is radically different than what it was beforehand, and also greatly favors someone like a Marty at this point. And unsurprisingly, he does end up winning here, which initially felt like it was going to lead to another boring Betty or Josh or Summerboo, and Betty and Josh do end up becoming the initial nominees, but it really felt like during this week, pretty much everything just ended up going right, which made this round as chaotic as it possibly could have been. Now we do start off Marty's HOH with finding out that Moose had told him in the previous week about the backdoor plan, which does lead to Gino finally doing good active work for the first time the entire season, in that he goes to Marty and tells him about Jacey's power, which fully puts Marty back in his corner. And again, Gino as a whole, I do think is a terrible strategic player, but this was actually a decent move from him that leads to him being safe for most of the week. And we do follow this up with seeing Kevin and Helena talk about wanting to take Gino out this week, but they don't think that Marty would actually do it, and this certainly didn't age well. A part of what caused this week to be as crazy as it was is the fact that we do have the return of Canada's vote to save one player, which I really hated when this was announced that this was something happening this late into the game, as it would have been disastrous had Gino won here, as it really would have shut down all intrigue for the week. And also, like, Gino was like the #1 target on the board coming into the week, with almost everyone targeting him, but again, once again, getting a very lucky comp result in Marty winning the HOH comp. That was obviously a major worry here, but instead we do get Summer winning the power instead, which ends up being a great result, as she was the potential replacement nominee. That now made it that if a nom had won the veto, Marty would be forced to nominate someone within his core 5. And what do you know? Betty wins her first comp, winning the veto, which was a really fun return of this counting in the coffin comp that had some fun reactions from Betty, Summer, and Josh as they had guts and maggots dumped on them. And Betty also has a great reaction to winning as well, kind of rubbing it in Marty's face, so that was fun. But this veto result could have easily screwed over Kevin or Helena, where at the point the veto was won here, Gino and Jace were actually winning this battle over influence over Marty, where Gino had made a solid move in pulling Marty over, and also Marty started to lose some trust with Kevin due to seeing him having conversations with Josh that made him kind of realize that they were probably working together. So again, this could have been really bad for Kevin and Helena, but ends up working out for the better for them here. And really, this entire Wednesday episode from this week here will probably go down as one of the best episodes in BB Can history to me, where after the veto comp, we do get the return of Marsha the Moose, and Kevin gets this task to pretend that he's going to self-evict. And this was fantastic. I mean, I love everything about this segment. I mean, we do see him first tell Josh, who gets really emotional, which really should have shown the other players how close they were, but it seemed like most people didn't pick up on this. But again, especially when we have like Josh telling the others that he's gonna self-evict before Kevin can so he can stop him, it really shows just how much of a stranglehold Kevin had on Josh at this point. We even see Betty getting emotional when he tells her. They edit out his talk with Helena, which was hilarious, like Helena grabbing onto his legs while she's on her knees, and that was a ridiculous visual. And I do find it weird that we didn't see that, but they bothered to show Jason Summers' talks with him, where in reality they didn't believe him. However, they like portray it as they did, but again, to me, the Helena one was definitely one that should have been more important. We also get a nice scene between him and Gino, which was kind of awkward as they're like super close, and Gino has these like really short shorts on, so it didn't even look like he was wearing pants. But Gino seemed genuinely worried for Kevin here, and we do see him go to the DR, and he tells them about his worries, and really, again, as much as I will bash Gino's game, and also just how boring he is, I do feel like he is genuinely a nice guy, and this is a shining example of that. We also get a fun reaction from Marty, who doesn't believe Kevin, but we do see him like blocking the door so that Kevin can't leave, only for like Kevin to trick him so that he can run out. Again, all of that was so much fun, and really this is probably one of my favorite segments of the entire season, but it certainly didn't help Kevin's game at this point, where again, coming into this, Marty had already been planning on nominating Kevin as he didn't trust him to not flip the vote, and again, because of his relationship with Josh. But Evan then pulls off a miracle here, where he finally, after days of failing to get to Marty, he finally has a great plea, really playing up how hurt he is that he could be nominated, and he ends up swearing on his marriage and his wedding ring, which is incredible that this plea ends up being successful because, again, Kevin isn't married, and I think this is the first time a lie like this has had such a major positive game ramification for someone. Where I think when people usually lie about things like their marital status or their sexuality or even their occupation, it ends up leading to them being a bit more reserved in the game, which ends up kind of backfiring on them. And if not, then probably doesn't affect anything at all. But Kevin here is actively able to use this to convince Marty that he's fully on board and turn what was going to be a 100% chance that he's going on the block into a 25% chance. And with that, let's get into Marty's new plan that he creates here, where now he has no easy options. Then now they're going to leave it up to a red gummy bear, where Marty wants to do a random draw between Kevin, Helena, and Jace to decide the nominee, and they agree to this in what is a ridiculous scene where he gathers the entire alliance in the HH room and makes them all promise and swear that they're going to vote to save each other. But right before the actual draw itself, Marty asked Gino, who he had constantly promised safety to, if he would like to add his gummy to the draw, and Gino says yes, which is insane. But I do feel like it's not quite the all-time bad move that some people claim. I mean, I know a lot of people claim that this is comparable to Jed's move, but to me, Jed's is worse, as Gino doesn't explicitly want to be on the block like Jed did. Gino's move here is more of a move of telling his alliance that he trusts them and that he is with them, which again ends up backfiring and is terrible here, but at least is one that I feel like makes logical sense and doesn't directly put him in danger, where again, it's a 25% chance that he's going to be on the block, and it just ends up not going his way. And also, this entire situation of Marty asking Gino if he wants his gummy in the draw is all a test from Marty anyway. Like, he is clearly testing Gino's loyalty to the Alliance. So at least in that sense, I can at least understand where Gino is coming from here. Again, it's still bad, as again, if he just said no, he would have been safe. And even if Marty had gone back on that, it would have been a terrible look for Marty. So he doesn't really have much incentive to actually do that. But even if Marty is annoyed that he didn't enter himself into the draw, what's he gonna do beyond this nomination? Like, he doesn't have a chance to win HOH in the very next round. So, like, the only time Marty would actually be able to do something here is if he wins the next veto and then also wins the next HOH. So, again, I do think logically, like, Gino 100% still should have said no, but I at least understand why he says yes. But again, we get to the draw, and as if the Big Brother gods were watching, Gino ends up drawing the red gummy, putting him on the block. And we do end the Wednesday night episode with this cliffhanger of Kevin just relishing at the thought of Marty offering Gino up on a silver platter, which again was incredible TV. And really, the scene was edited so perfectly too, with us getting to see everyone else's reactions first before we get the reveal that Gino is the one that drew it. Again, really fantastic here. And with Gino now on the block, Kevin and Helena are now the swings, and Kevin never truly wavered from voting Gino out, where the impending downfall of Gino was such a riveting part of the end of this week. And we do get some fun moments from, like, Helena telling Jace that if Kevin were to flip, she would have to flip too. And this entire conversation was so awkward, with Helena clearly being such a bad liar here, not even looking at Jace at any point during this conversation. But this does lead to Jace picking up on the fact that Gino might be in danger, and it was fun to see them panicking and going to Marty, who had to calm them down. And really, at first, I didn't like how Kevin and Helena were handling this vote, where they really don't end up telling Betty and Summer where they're going to go until the day before, which really opened up time for Jace to start bonding with Betty and Summer, to where it did seem like Kevin and Helena could have been in danger coming into the triple. But they really end up playing the penultimate day really well, using Jacey's power against her in pulling over Betty and Summer by telling them about it, and also convincing them that Jacey had been lying to them the whole time about the Marty backdoor plan, and that they had in reality been wanting to backdoor Josh had anything happen, which again makes Betty and Summer think that they're being played by Jace. And this was all really impressive gameplay from Kevin and Helena that really ends up benefiting them the very next week. And thankfully, by the time we get to the eventual vote, it does still end up being a blindside, where we do get some great reactions from Jace and Marty, who are clearly shocked, while Gino's as stone-faced as ever. But on his way out, he does call out the three-headed dragon, which includes Marty, which obviously shows you the incredible read that Gino had on the game still. But really, this round just ends up being really insane. One of the best rounds of Big Brother possibly ever. And with that, now let's talk about Gino, who again seemed like the nicest and most chill person in the world, but also was so strategically bad at this game. And despite him being the biggest jury threat on the board, he was so lucky to get into the position he was in to begin with. But again, he had a good start where he was really well positioned despite him not really doing anything. And really, I think his greatest flaw here is the fact that he is too passive in the game. And to go even beyond that, he's also just too nice of a guy, where again, he has this misguided notion that appeasing people will get them to keep you around, as he did that with taking out Kyle, and he did that with him putting in his gummy, when again, in a game like Big Brother, they don't care. They're gonna take you out anyway, especially if you're as big of a threat as Gino is. And really, that's the lesson I feel like he would need to learn if he were to ever truly do well in the game Big Brother, again, without the massive amount of luck they end up having, or without obviously a bunch of comp wins. But moving forward, we're not done this week just yet. We do still have the triple eviction, which, I mean, I still don't like the concept of a triple eviction, especially the BB Can version of it, but this did end up being one of the better ones. Probably my second favorite to the BB Can 3 triple. Though I will say the overall pacing of the episode was very strange, where we only had like half the episode dedicated to the actual triple, with them wasting a lot of time early on by showing the jury house, which was a fun segment, but not necessarily one that needed to be in this episode. But coming into the triple here, everyone but Jace were going to nominate Marty and Jace, with Jace herself probably nominating Marty anyway. So again, Marty was in a lot of danger. no matter what. However, Jace does come pretty close to winning the HOH here, but Josh ends up winning it instead, winning his first comp, which led to him having to make some really interesting choices, which I do think at the end of the day he ends up handling pretty poorly, which again really showed you how snowed he was by Kevin at this point. And humorously, when he wins, we do see both Betty and Summer having these ridiculous reactions, thinking they're safe, which doesn't even last 2 minutes after he wins, as right away we do see Josh end up using Summer as a pawn, which was expected to people that watched the feeds, as again it did seem pretty clear that Josh's loyalties were to the crash test dummies and then to Betty, with Summer kind of being on the outs. Though we do see Summer being completely blindsided by this, and we do see a short argument between her and Josh, which was pretty fun, but we do end up having Jace win the veto, and this is where Josh gets another big decision, where again at this point we know that he is fully loyal to Kevin and through that the crash test dummies, but his persona has been that he's extremely loyal to Betty, and Betty is not the type of person that would instantly take you back after you betray her. So I did feel like this was a really difficult choice for Josh, and I do think he should have gone for nominating Helena, as one, I do think Helena would have been safe anyway, but also I feel like that relationship's a lot more repairable than the option he does go with, which is putting up Betty. And also by putting up Betty here, he does open up the opportunity for Kevin and Helena to vote her out. It does gain Kevin and Helena a lot of leverage here with Betty, where she looks at them as her savior at this point, which again is another reason why this was overall net negative for Josh. But by the time of the actual eviction itself, it does go anticlimactically here, where we do lose both Marty and Summer, with the two having radically different reactions to their vote-offs here. Marty, surprisingly to me, going out in a very gracious way, seeming to have no ill wills, while Summer goes out really hurt and betrayed by what Josh did. Which I think both are fun ways to leave the game, especially like I think with Marty, it's like the opposite of what you would expect from him. Also having a bitter exit like Summer's can also be really fun at points as well. Though I will say I didn't love that Summer didn't even seem to try to stay, where I do feel like there was definitely an argument for her to flip them over, but instead she doesn't really even try here, and instead tells them that she's not going to waste her breath on them during her final plea. But still, a fun exit from the show. And with that, let's talk about the boots from the triple here, starting with Marty, who again, I think Marty is another really terrible strategic player. While he did have good reads at points, he also had even more bad reads throughout the game, and he does have this like weird moral code while playing the game of him constantly having to be honest to his own detriment, of him constantly telling people that he was going to put them up or that he betrayed them, really leading to a lot of suboptimal play. But despite that, Marty was someone that I thought could have potentially gone on a Kevin Martin BB Can 5 run of him just winning his way out to the end. And obviously instead he ends up going out the way Kevin did in BB Can 3 in the middle of a triple. But Marty is the person on this cast that I would have the most faith in to win out from like the halfway point in the game. Like I do think he is for sure one of the better comp competitors on the season, though he was just so bad at the other aspects of the game, especially by the midpoint in the season, where he ends up burning a lot of his relationships and starts to be guided more so by revenge than he is of his actual strategic play. But now let's move on to Summer, who I think is a fantastic character. Again, I think she has fun energy in the DRs. However, I do think my initial read of her as a player was a mostly accurate one. I mean, she is one that has some ability in the game, from her being mostly good socially and her having some solid reads at points. But I do think she is a player that can get tunnel visioned in the game, and through that not really see the game that's being played around her, where also like Marty, I think she's too honest in the game and makes it very clear to people like Kyle and Marty that she is against them. She also ends up like telling Betty that she's unsure of her vote, which is really bad. I think she's overall a player that's a bit too emotionally guided. But I mean, again, there was a point in the game where she was the best position in the house. No one was really targeting Summer, even at this point where she would have always been a secondary target. She's really just the collateral damage of the triple here. Though had Jace not won the veto, I mean, she would have been safe there as well. Now, I do think she was running out of runway, and a lot of that's because she just kind of stopped playing the game as actively and was kind of more tunnel vision on getting Gino and Marty out. So I do think there is a level potential there, but I think to truly reach it, I think she would have to get rid of the pettiness that she seems to thrive on. Now for week 9, the final 5 round, which you would think after the triple that the game would start to wind down, but this week ends up being one of the best final 5 rounds in recent history. And obviously a lot of this review has been dedicated to praising Kevin's game across the season, but this was definitely the week where I do feel like he really dropped the ball here, as coming into this week with the triple playing out pretty much exactly like he would have wanted it to go, he now has both Josh and Helena fully loyal to him, both taking him to final 2. He has Betty now burned by Josh, and through that now closer to Kevin more so than anyone else in the house, meaning that essentially if the status quo stays the same throughout this week and Jace doesn't win a comp, which she doesn't end up doing, he would have been locked in for final 2, in a position where it seemed like the jury was finally starting to gain respect for his game. But again, this week really gives me some hesitancy on Kevin's ability while playing from the top, as for most of the season, he is obviously playing really well from the bottom, in a position where he doesn't inherently have a lot of power. But now playing from a power position, I do have a lot of question marks over how he played here. Now that said, he does do some pretty impressive work alongside Helena and how they handle Betty, making sure that she doesn't reconcile with Josh immediately, and with Betty also ending up winning this HOH, and through the work they had done in the previous week in turning Betty against Jace, this leads to them somehow avoiding the block at the final 5 here, which is insanely impressive. Now this week was another weirdly structured one on their show, with most of the Monday episode focusing around the events of the triple, where we do see more of Summer's fight with Josh and Jace's fight with Helena, which were fun segments. We do also see Betty being told about her nomination, which leads to some great reactions from her as she slowly starts to realize that Josh is putting her up, and seeing her run through the entire house campaigning was fun as well. But this alone should have been a major indicator to Betty here that Kevin, Josh, and Helena were obviously working together, but she ends up not really putting it together here, and instead fully leans into Kevin and Helena being the ones that saved her, and plans on going to the final 3 of them initially here. Again, this really worked out perfectly for Kevin and Helena, which makes it all so disappointing that they weren't able to take full advantage of this. But then we get to the first mistake that Kevin ends up making here, which happened during Wendy's, where Kevin decides to reveal to Betty that him and Josh have had a final 2, in an attempt to further distance Betty and Josh by showing her how deceivious Josh has been to her the entire season. However, he doesn't recognize the fact that this is easily going to backfire on him, with now this showing to Betty that he is equally as deceivious, causing Betty to recognize his game, and that Kevin is this mastermind, and in turn fully turns Betty against Kevin here, to which she later takes this information to Josh, where she's able to turn Josh against Kevin as well. And to be honest, it probably even further bonds the two through their mutual hatred of Kevin at this point, with Josh now recognizing how much Kevin has played him as well. So again, like, Kevin goes from having all but one person taking him to the end to now only having one person in Helena taking him to the end, and makes him a potential target moving forward for Josh and Betty. Again, really crumbling his position in the game here to where he could have even gone home this week had Josh won the veto. But instead, we do end up seeing Helena win the veto, and along with that comes a strategy session with Kevin Martin, which felt very random. But also this week, we have Ika hosting the HOH comp, which includes plenty of references to her shredding the letters. Also, we get the loved one visit, where they get to talk to them through a glass door, something they've done in previous seasons as well. So again, a lot of callbacks over the course of this week. But with Helena not using the veto, Kevin and Helena now have the sole decision on who to evict. And this is truly the greatest flaw of this week in my eyes, where, again, they really just handle the power here all wrong, which, to be fair, feels in line with this season that is filled with suboptimal play. But it was really frustrating to see these two really competent, impressive players in the last few rounds in particular wavering between who to vote out here and openly doing so, and ultimately choosing the wrong decision by the end of it. Now, coming into this round, Kevin and Helena had two conflicting interests here, where Josh was going to be taking Kevin to the end, while Jace was going to be taking Helena to the end. Though, obviously, again, through the course of this week, Josh ends up being exposed to what Kevin is doing, and the two never truly have a conversation here to repair their relationship, which I know some people blame Kevin for, and obviously it is a knock against Kevin, but I also think it's equally a knock against Josh, especially in the position where he needs their vote to stay. But again, for someone that was as impressive in the game as Kevin, for him to not recognize that Josh was drifting away, again, that is definitely a knock there. But through this all, the benefits of keeping Josh around become less and less, as Josh is on par, if not better than Jace in competitions, has other options on who to work with, namely Betty. So for Kevin in particular at this point, like, it's not even really in his best interest to keep Josh anymore. But again, really the biggest flaw here is them waffling on their choice, which is kind of a double-edged thing. Obviously, they are letting both sides know at certain points that they are siding with the other side, which obviously is just inherently bad to let people know that you're thinking about voting them out. But then also the thing that is probably even more detrimental is through that they're not managing their relationships for the future. They're wasting so much time on making the decision for the present that they're not thinking about what happens at Final Four or Final Three, where obviously they end up keeping Josh. But if they were going to keep Josh, they should have managed Josh throughout this week instead of just kind of letting him go, because they're wasting so much time thinking about what they're going to do. But as for the campaigning, I mean, again, like, we do see Jace do some pretty effective campaigning across this week. While she does fail in convincing Betty not to put her on the block, she does do a pretty decent campaign to Kevin that, I mean, it's probably the most impressive display for gameplay across the season, which is sad considering it's her boot week. But she ends up turning both Kevin and Helena against Josh, which again, at this point, is fully in their best interest, and even ends up promising Kevin to take him to Final Two, which she claims after fact she would have been loyal to, which makes it an even dumber decision for Kevin not to keep her around. But at this point, again, it definitely looked like it was on a bit of a rebound for Kevin, with him now having a new Final Two with Jace, and this meaning that essentially it's only Betty that is coming after him in the next round. But it's all for naught, because Josh ends up finally campaigning to Kevin and Helena at the last second, after Kevin and Helena had already told Betty that they are voting out Josh, which causes him to campaign and ends up flipping the back through the promise of throwing the Final Four HOH, which is ridiculous that they believe that he's actually going to do this. And they do obviously make the decision to vote out Jace over Josh here, which to me is just really asinine. It really felt like a fall from grace for Kevin and Helena here, especially with Helena not seeming to have a mind of her own across this week, just going with the whim of whatever Kevin wants to do. And this happens numerous times across the season, but Helena really is in a position where she really needs to differentiate herself from Kevin, as she always intends to go to the end with Kevin, but hasn't made enough independent moves and showcased her game independently to the point where she has any respect from the jury. She continues to let Kevin get his way and tell the others that Kevin is making the decisions, which she thinks is good jury management under the assumption that she's making it look like she wants to save these people. But in reality, it's really just showing Helena not getting her way round after round. And I feel like this was such a major flaw in her game. And speaking of major flaws in Helena's game, we do also get a goodbye message to Jace, which is just really terrible. I mean, one of the worst goodbye messages post-jury in recent history to me. I mean, when we get to the point where, like, Jace is literally saying, "Shut up, Helena," in the middle of her goodbye message, you know, it's a bad sign. And also with, like, Jace also seeming genuinely touched by what Kevin and Josh said about her, propping up her game. It really just made Helena look even worse there. But with that, I mean, let's talk about Jacey-Lynne, who, again, to me is a player that I think has a lot of potential here. I mean, she demonstrated some decent gameplay at points throughout the season, but only seemed to be willing to play the game when she faced adversity. And when she bothered to actively play the game, I feel like she was playing decently well, making solid pitches and building strong relationships, but she just didn't do it consistently enough. Again, she does branch her wings in week 2 after being nominated. She does build a bond with Jess that keeps her and Gino safe. She initially is able to win over Betty in Summer before the triple until Kevin and Helena end up lying about the Marty backdoor. She does end up flipping Kevin and Helena for a bit this week and would have had some serious win equity had she survived it. But again, I just wish we got to see her play more actively across the season, where instead we get these like little snippets of her playing the game. So again, I do feel like there's a lot of potential there, but it wasn't fully realized across this season. And now for the Final Four round, which very much felt like a reckoning for the terrible decision that Kevin and Helena had just made, where first we do end up seeing what's behind this mysterious red door that's been hyped up in the edit, only for it to turn out to be a Wendy's breakfast commercial, which was ridiculous, though it is also where the Final Four HOH will take place, and before it, the players get to practice the competition, which we do end up seeing Kevin practice for as long as possible, which makes it even more humorous that he ends up sucking at the comp, which ends up giving Josh an easy win here, despite the fact that he promised to throw it, which does lead to some awkward scenes of Kevin trying to hash it out with Josh, and Josh not really owning up to the fact that he did lie to them there, and also just felt like an instant comeuppance for Kevin and Helena now realizing that they've been played by Josh. We also get the BB Can Awards as expected, and I do feel like they did a pretty poor job in the clip selection here, where most of these moments felt pretty mundane. Also, we get the final Wendy's visit with Josh getting messages from the runners-up now that they've gone through every winner, and I felt like it was kind of lame to me to have him get advice from the players that lost a jury vote. And even then, we only get 3 runners-up here in Sabrina, Karen, and Brayden, who were cool to see, but I mean, it did feel weird that we didn't get Godfrey, Kayla, or Anthony, who to me are much stronger runners-up. So I did find the segment kind of awkward. But then we do get to the noms, which don't matter, obviously, but Josh does nominate Betty and Kevin to allow Helena to keep her never nominated record, which he mentions that this will make Helena look bad to the jury in the case he's sitting next to her, which felt like a complete misread there, where like really that was the only thing keeping Helena's winning chances afloat. And even then, to be honest, not really, but to be honest, that was like the one minor positive she had coming into a jury vote. And I will say that just in general, I was genuinely tricked by the edit this week, as the feeds did stop before the eviction, and with the edit here giving Kevin a lot of content that really felt like this being his swan song. And we have this confessional from Josh that made it very clear that he was leaning towards taking out Kevin. It did make me very much expect Kevin to be the boot here, especially after we see Josh win the veto as well. But we do see a lot of last second campaigning here, where Kevin and Helena don't even seem to campaign against each other here, and more so put all their hopes in Josh taking out Betty, which to me at first felt like a terrible move, as I never expected that Josh would even consider it. But then we do see Kevin give a pretty great pitch to Josh here, and we do see how emotional Josh gets with it. That made me think for an instant that it might have worked. And when we return from commercial, we do see Josh talking to Betty in what seemed like a start of a convo where he was going to tell her that she was going home, only for it to turn to him telling her that he's going to use the veto on her. And then we get the debate between who to take out between Kevin and Helena, where we do see them having this complete misread on the jury, talking about how Kevin can't win a jury vote, which clearly shows them not being able to look outside of their own perspectives, as by this point it was pretty clear that Kevin was the biggest jury threat on the board. But really the true point of contention ends up being Helena's compability, with her being the perceived bigger threat all around, and because that they do end up voting her out, which to me ends up being a bad move for both of them here, where again Kevin is the bigger jury threat and they don't recognize that, while Helena is a massive goat that would be very easy to beat at the end had they both gone to the end with her. Also, the difference between Kevin and Helena in terms of compability isn't that large, as Kevin has already been proven to do better at quiz comps than Helena, and with both Kevin and Helena having done better than Betty in the recent standard endgame comps as well, like I really just feel like this was a poor decision for them to make here, where it just increases the chances that Kevin might make it to the end and win against them. And I will also say that I know a lot of people do credit Kevin with saying this week, however I will say that I don't really credit him that much here, where despite again Kevin giving what I think was a pretty good pitch to Josh, that was the wrong pitch to make. I mean, Josh clearly was never going to vote out Betty, so really all of his campaigning was mostly ineffective. And the main thing that was effective was his threat management, him making himself look like a smaller threat in comparison to Helena. But also, I feel like the main reason why he gets kept around is more so due to his lack of comp ability, which is not something he was trying to minimize his threat level of. He was genuinely trying to win these comps and actually sucked at them. So again, I think giving Kevin credit for staying this round is a bit misplaced, considering he kind of stays due to things that he wasn't even trying to do. But with that, let's talk about Helena, who was a solid player across the season, obviously working alongside Kevin throughout the game, and in terms of how she navigated through the game, I do think she did pretty well, having certain relationships that did help her and Kevin control the game at some pretty integral points. But I do have many issues with how she managed the jury, with her actively burning jury votes and making it clear that Kevin was the one running her strategic game. And also, I do feel like Kevin did run her strategic game. I mean, while Helena herself has a decent strategic mind for the game, she did just allow Kevin to get his way anytime they had to make a decision. I do wish she was more forceful in her pushing for what she thought was in her own best interest over what Kevin thought, where the Jace vote is a major example of that, and essentially what causes her direct downfall the immediate next week. So while I do think she still played a strong game here, I do find it underwhelming how she didn't really fight to get her way throughout most of the game, and I do feel like she was mostly misguided in how she handled the end game here, to where I don't think she would win in any scenario at the end. And now for the finale here, which, wow. I genuinely cannot believe how thrilling of a finale we ended up getting here, where I fully came into it thinking that Josh was clearly going to win the final HOH and end up winning the game, or if not, maybe get a Betty win. But for us to get this number of twists and turns in a single finale just ended up being completely insane here. Now, BB Can finales typically do have these over-the-top intros, and this one was no different, but I did like how they did do a rundown of BB Can history, highlighting each of the former winners and referencing BB Can 8, so I found that nice to see. But then we jump into part 1 of the final HOH, which starts this roller coaster of an episode where, despite the odds being against Kevin here, we do see him win part 1, which I never thought was a possibility. I mean, to me, when we see a comp like this that does have a physical element to it, balance element, coordination, like I fully expected Josh to win a competition like this. And considering there were fake spoilers out there that said that Kevin was shut out of part 3, I mean, this came as a genuine surprise and instantly kickstarted the thought that Kevin can still win this game, despite seeming to be in a really terrible position after that disastrous final 5 round. Part 2 ends up being mostly mundane, as obviously it didn't really matter too much, as no matter who won part 2, it seemed like Kevin would need to win final HOH anyway, though Josh was the clear frontrunner here and does end up winning, with Betty putting up a time of over 2 hours, which was funny. But this leads up to this epic showdown in part 3 of Kevin versus Josh, with like the assumption that whoever wins this HOH is more than likely going to win the game. Now, I will say that I was underwhelmed that the final HOH here still remained this like basic Q&A about the jurors, and really just overall, I do feel like the end game comps to me ended up being underwhelming. While I did praise the more equal competitions early on in the season, I do feel like they kept the end game the same, which obviously led to some comps favoring physicality and the requirement of studying days still being very important here, which I did feel like gave Josh a pretty big advantage here. I mean, Kevin's definitely not a slouch, but Josh has been consistently great at comps like this. And when we see Kevin miss the first question, I really thought it was over here. But then Josh later misses a question, making it come down to the tiebreaker. Again, really as intense as it possibly could have been, only for Josh to still win the final HOH here. And at this point, I mean, having obviously rooted for Kevin due to the tremendous game that he ends up playing across the season, I was disappointed that he was more than likely not going to win. And in the back of my head, obviously, there is the chance that Kevin's constant campaigning about how Betty is this massive underdog that would win a jury vote. There was a chance that obviously clicked with Josh, but I didn't think it was that likely considering we saw Josh's Final Four decision. But then Josh gets up the vote and he says, "I'm voting out my best friend," and he votes out Betty. And I haven't been this shocked by an individual move or really individual moment in Big Brother in a very, very long time, if not ever. Like, I mean, this was a genuine surprise to me. Like, the fact that Kevin was able to somehow pull this off, to see these weeks of work he's been putting into Josh and telling him how big of a jury threat Betty will be, really shows that no matter how tricky of a situation Kevin got himself into on this season, he still found a way to get out of it. And along with this comes the heartbreaking reaction from Betty, where obviously I do really feel for her, but it is also great TV here. And I did feel like it was the best possible outcome for this season here to further cement Kevin's legacy as a great player, but also having this heart-wrenching downfall for Josh and Betty at the end here. But with that, let's talk about Betty, who was obviously great TV across the season. And while she isn't my favorite style of player, being this very emotional and reactive one, and I do overall have mixed opinions on her as a player, considering she was one of the more active players on this season, despite the fact that she was mostly ineffective, but obviously has a few shining moments there. But again, like as a character though, I mean, she is such a breath of fresh air. To see her genuine reactions to people betraying her, seeing her pettiness, her argument with Kevin early on in the game was really fun. Her reactions to her comp wins were fun. I did really enjoy what Betty brought to the show here, but I do feel like her winning would have been underwhelming to me, especially over Kevin, Josh, and even Helena, who were more integral to how the game played out. And while she would have been a train wrecky winner that would have fit with this train wrecky season, I do feel like her getting booted here was the best case scenario for me. But now let's jump into the rest of the finale, where we did have a pretty mundane jury roundtable and later reunion show as well, which in BB Can tradition was kind of straight up boring, outside the reveal of Kevin's marriage being fake. But we did get some solid jury questioning considering the format here, where Kevin gives a really fantastic performance, going from person to person, saying exactly what you need to say to get their votes, and having a really great speech at the end where the jury is laughing and cheering him on by the end. all while they seemed extremely angry at Josh, and Josh himself felt very disheveled here, obviously due to what he just did to Betty, and to see him get roasted by Summer, and you see him shaking his head at points to what Kevin was saying. It made it clear that he was starting to recognize that he was on the losing end here. And this was such a tragedy for Josh here, for him to cut Betty thinking that he was going to get the easy win, only for him to lose to Kevin, the person he was trying to not win the game. I mean, this like kind of tragic downfall for him is kind of a satisfying conclusion to his arc across the season. Now, also, we did get one of the jury votes coming from Canada, which I obviously don't like conceptually, and obviously if it was like the entire result being dictated by a public vote, then that would be dreadful, but I don't 100% hate it in this position where, again, it's only one vote, which essentially means it's just the tiebreaker on what is already a relatively large jury, to where like to make this actually matter, you would need to get 4 votes to begin with. So again, like I don't have as much of an issue with it in this particular situation, though considering the fact that Marty wins Canada's favorite, probably does lean into the fact that I don't have much faith in Canada to pick what I would consider the most satisfying winner. But we get to the votes where Kevin ends up winning against Josh, and what I thought was possibly going to be a unanimous vote, but Betty does still end up voting for Josh, humorously saying, I'm voting for a person that did play the game, which is, again, that's Betty for you. But still, really satisfying conclusion here to even see Kevin completely shocked at all the votes that he's getting, and Kevin ends up being an insanely impressive winner here, with his win here really solidifying this season as an all-time great one for me. Now, before ending the review, we will run through the final 2, starting off with Josh, who I think ends up being a really complex figure across this season. I think in many ways, his endgame can be looked at as this tragedy for him, seeing him pick Kevin over Betty, thinking that he's going to win the game with that decision, only for him to lose in devastating fashion. And despite him like starting to figure out what Kevin was doing and how manipulative of a game he was playing, he still decides to take him to the end. And again, I just found this downfall for Josh here really fascinating. Now, from a gameplay perspective, Josh was a very impressive social player across the season, with almost everyone seeming to genuinely love him and want to work with him, which obviously makes them even more hurt when he does eventually cut them. And to add that he is lacking strategically in the sense that he was always outclassed by players like Kevin and Helena throughout most of the game, and really at every point except for the tail end of the final 5 round, and really is just too passive in the game at points. Plus also was just like completely snowed by Kevin throughout a lot of the game that did lead to him making a lot of suboptimal moves, particularly in how he ends up dealing with Betty, how he deals with Summer. But despite those things, I do think Josh is a mostly solid all-around player. I mean, I do think what he lacks strategically is something that could easily be learned if he were to eventually play again. But I do think he is someone that is very emotional and someone that just seems to genuinely be a nice guy, to the point where like I don't know if he would truly be able to maximize the potential that he would have. Though the fact that he was willing to cut Betty at the very end, I do think shows that he does have a killer instinct, if only he had a correct read on the game. So while Josh obviously made a lot of suboptimal moves across this season, I do think he is still probably one of the better players of this season, and someone I can definitely see doing very well on a return. But with that, let's jump to our winner here in Kevin, who comes out of this season playing an all-time great game. I mean, his winning game here very much reminds me of Dan's BB10 game, but probably even more impressive to me, where the amount of adversity that Kevin has to face here is near unprecedented for a winning game. I'm really across all of Big Brother, the only game that I can think of that's up there is something like Dan from BB14, and for him to come out winning this season after being in such a bad position coming into the season and being nominated the very first week, a position where literally no one has ever won the game after surviving to vote the first round. He's also the first winner since Dr. Will to win the game without winning a single HOH. I mean, to me, Kevin really plays a very unprecedented game here, a game that I didn't think was possible in the modern day, and one that obviously makes him an all-time great player for BB Can, and he's probably up there when you add in US as well. And for me, he's definitely in the upper echelon of players for Big Brother, though he is not without his flaws. I mean, despite the fact that I come out of this season having learned the fact that you should never doubt Kevin, as he's able to get himself out of numerous tricky positions, but I do still wonder his consistency on any given season. Obviously, he's able to get out of a lot of sticky situations in this particular season, but it's with the same cast. I do wonder if he's able to do that with a different style of cast. And considering he is a player that's almost always going to start the game on the bottom and have to work his way up, I do feel like there are probably going to be casts that he's not able to work his way up. So again, this lack of clarity on his consistency in the game is something that doesn't really solidify his position in the top of the top tier of players to me. I mean, to me, he would need another run where he does play solidly on that season to really solidify his spot as a potential best player of all time. And again, a lot of that comes from the fact that the game that Kevin has to play is one that is a lot harder than the games of Cody Calafiore or a Dane or some of these more fully well-rounded players that can win competitions while also being very impressive in the social strategy elements of the game, and also seem to be players that will always find themselves in the majority at the beginning of a season. So considering Kevin doesn't have that level of consistency, again, I'm hesitant to put him at number 1 for BB Can. Again, for me, I think he would be right below Dane, and including US, I think he's for sure top 10. But also in terms of his winning game here, it's not perfect. I mean, it is a winning game where he does have a pretty bad final 5 round, where again, even though it ends up working out for him, he does play that round suboptimally, where again, it's not about the decision of who to pick between Josh and Jace, it's about how he handles that position. And considering he leaves that week with Josh against him, that's obviously a massive negative. He fails to get his way at Final 4, where he fails to convince Josh to keep Helena around and doesn't really have much control over how the game is being played out in the first 4 rounds of the game, where in that point in the game, he's more so in survival mode. That again is impressive from a player standpoint, especially considering he does do very good work across those weeks, but in comparison to, again, someone like a Dane who had more direct influence in how the game was being played out throughout the entirety of the season, I do feel like for me, Kevin's winning game is probably 1 spot below it. But again, there's still impressive elements of his game. Again, from week 5 until the final 5, he is essentially running the game in a position where he's from the bottom. He's on the bottom, having to maneuver his way and convince the people in power to do things that are in his best interest, which again is very, very impressive. Again, this is one of the most impressive games I have ever seen. Again, the amount of adversity that he faces along the way is near unprecedented for a winning game. But again, like I think in terms of like the amount of control he had over the season, I do think the Codys of the world, the Dereks of the world, the Danes of the world are stronger winners as a whole. Even like an Andy is probably stronger, considering Andy was never in danger, more in the power position for a lot of the game. But again, Kevin's still up there. Kevin is, again, for me, back to back with Dan from BB10 in terms of winning game. I would even argue maybe above it, maybe below. Again, I think there's pros and cons for both, but very impressive game. A game that I really did not think we would ever see again on a modern season of the show, which makes this such a satisfying conclusion to the season. But with that, that is the entire season of BB Can 10, which was really incredible in an unprecedented way. I did struggle early on with how I felt about the season because the gameplay was so sporadic and it really just felt like a train wreck where we didn't know who was going to grab the reins of the game. But eventually when Kevin starts to shine, and now knowing that Kevin eventually ends up winning the season, and along with the great downfall of Josh and Betty that happens across the season, and along with this like tragic downfall for Josh and Betty that happens, and iconic moments like the cow HOH and the red gummy bear, this is truly an all-time great season, to the point where it might be the best ever. I mean, this season very much feels like a parallel to BB10 in the US, which I think is the best US season, but I think this might be better. And I've always said that BB Can 5 is my favorite BB Can season, and as time went on, it started to rise to the point where I do think I would have it above BB10 at this point for me. And the fact that this season rivals that, and I think there's serious arguments for it being better. Now, obviously, this might be recency bias as the season literally just ended, but the events of this final week and also the satisfying conclusion have really propelled this season to where obviously things can change over time, but I truly do think that BB Can 10 here is the best Big Brother season ever. I mean, it's definitely BB Can at their best, where I feel like from a production standpoint, they did the best they could possibly do. Again, they edited the show properly. The casting was on point here. The comps were better. I mean, to me, this is a near perfect season of BB Can in a way that I really just can't believe how good the season got here. Where every point where I thought the season could potentially go downhill, it continued to rise to to where even in this endgame stretch that is typically pretty boring on Big Brother, it was still a riveting ride the entire way. Really one of the best seasons ever made. But with that, those are my thoughts on Big Brother Canada 10. Now moving forward, I will be doing a player ranking for the season. And I guess I should talk about this, considering I've mentioned this many times on my live streams, but I do think at some point before BB Can 11, I do want to do a bit of a grander video. And I think with this season and debate of where Kevin lands as a player, I think I'm going to do it. And that is a video where I rank every player in the history of Big Brother Canada. Now, I don't know exactly when this will be. It definitely won't be in the immediate future, but again, at some point before BB Can 11, I plan on doing it. It might not be until like immediately before next season, but you can definitely expect that video at some point in the next year, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.